We've heard a great deal over the years about the terrible demographic tragedy that struck the peoples of the New World in the Age of Discovery. But who were the greatest and most outspoken critics of the abuses of the natives? Catholic theologians. Let's talk about this issue today on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. Welcome to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Last week we talked about the Church and law, and for a good portion we talked about the Church's role in developing the idea of natural rights. This is a central concept in Western civilization, the idea that simply by virtue of being a human being, I possess certain rights that inhere in my very nature as a rational creature, that I have the right not to be killed, not to be expropriated, have my property taken away. I have these rights by virtue of being human. And I even cited an encyclical that I consider to be sort of recent, 1891 encyclical by Pope Leo XIII, in which he specifically said that the right to property is sacred and inviolable. So nobody can come up with some pretext for violating that. So these are important, liberating ideas in the best sense of the word. Today what we're going to talk about is the extension of this idea of rights to the whole world, and the suggestion that all the peoples of the world enjoy the same fundamental dignity because they're made in the image and likeness of God and they have that rational nature. All of us, identically, share in a dignity that demands the recognition of rights. This is a revolutionary idea. There are not many peoples in the world who have looked around at all the diversity of people in the world and said, let's bestow equal rights on everybody. This is not exactly the most popular idea in the history of mankind, but it came right out of the heart of the Church. Now let's begin by looking at the exact opposite of what the Church teaches. And then we can better appreciate why the Church's message is so revolutionary. And when I look at the exact opposite of what the Church teaches, I focus specifically on one of the great villains of political philosophy. In the early 16th century, a fellow named Machiavelli, who wrote an enormous amount, wrote a small book around 1513 called The Prince. When we look at The Prince, we find a totally secular analysis of politics. God is left out of the equation altogether. Morality is left out of the equation altogether. Sound a little bit familiar? That's what modern political life, in effect, has been like. These things are to be banished. Governments have to do what they have to do. And moral principles, will suffer in the process. Now, think about how St. Thomas Aquinas would have answered the question, what is political obligation? Or what is the nature of the state? Or what is the function of the ruler? And he would have thought, well, God's intention in establishing these institutions was, and then he would have gone on from there. Machiavelli has no truck with any of this. He's not interested in God's intention. That has no relevance to him whatsoever. Instead, Machiavelli looks at the state from the point of view of a cold, calculating theoretician. And in effect, what he wants to do is give advice to rulers. If you want to stay in power, you should do these things. And don't be caught up in moral concerns. Am I allowed to do these things? You have to do what you have to do. Because according to Machiavelli, the worst thing that can happen is the collapse of a state. So the state has to be able to do whatever it feels necessary to do to keep itself functioning. Because were it not for the state, we would all revert to a condition of civil war, of all against all, as in a later century Thomas Hobbes suggested. So therefore, the end that we have in mind, that is, keeping the state functioning and preserving the peace, is very important. So the means to that end become okay, whatever means necessary. So his advice to the prince is do what you have to do to maintain yourself in power, even if that means lying and cheating and stealing, and even worse. So, for example, it was a typical piece of Machiavellian advice to rulers that you should give the appearance of being generous, but don't be so foolish as actually to be generous. Or, it is good for you to be loved by your people, but much more important, if you can't swing that, is to be feared by them. This is classic Machiavellian advice, and part of the reason that Machiavelli despised the church and despised Christianity was that these things taught that states were subject to moral restraints. They were subject to the moral law. Machiavelli's state is subject to nothing other than necessity. And so Machiavelli would have disdained what the Catholic Church taught, that there are virtues that we ought to cultivate. We ought to cultivate the cardinal virtues of prudence, temperance, fortitude, and justice. We ought to pursue the three theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. All this falls out in Machiavelli's system, for there is only one virtue for Machiavelli, and that is the ability to survive. And that trumps everything, and that extends to states in particular. States have to survive, so they need to be able to do what they need to do. And it is unjust for a state to be held up to moral scrutiny. It won't work, it's impractical, and that, in effect, is Machiavelli's message. Now, the Church condemned Machiavelli's work in no uncertain terms. They condemned it because they believe that there are such things as moral standards when it comes to government. Now, it's one thing for a teenager to go around saying this. This is the typical teenage morality, isn't it? I'm not going to get my moral teaching from any of you people. I'll just live by my own code. You know, every teenager has this view, you know, during the teenage years, and then most of them grow up and realize how stupid they're being. But the typical teenage mentality is, I don't need to read your Bible or listen to your preaching or even listen to my parents. I'll make up my own rules, blah, blah, blah. Now, that's bad enough when a teenager teaches that. But when a government believes that, then you're getting into something very dangerous. So what the Church teaches is that states can not only be held up for moral accountability, but they can also be held up to moral scrutiny in how they interact with other states. There are moral rules that govern how they interact with other states. They can't just do whatever they want or whatever they think is to their passing advantage. They have to be subject to the moral law. Machiavelli would be absolutely livid at this suggestion. But the Church teaches that an absolute, unchanging standard of justice applies to all peoples alike. This, in effect, is what international law is. The idea that all states are subject to certain rules and restraints. Now, let me anticipate an objection here. The fact that you believe that there is such a thing as international law does not mean you have to be the world's greatest cheerleader for the United Nations, because you may be saying, isn't the United Nations made up in large part of a bunch of bozos and dangerous and weird people, and don't they say a lot of strange things, and we would never want to be governed by these people? And I couldn't agree more. In fact, some of you may remember Bill Buckley's old statement that he would rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone directory than by the faculty of Harvard. Well, I sort of feel that way about the United Nations General Assembly. So I don't mean to suggest that you have to be a big cheerleader for the United Nations. The question is the principle. As long as we recognize the principle that governments are subject to some kind of moral rules, then we can leave aside, for our purposes anyway, how would you enforce those rules? Because, of course, as soon as you establish a United Nations to govern the interaction of states, the question then becomes, well, who's going to govern the United Nations? You haven't really solved the problem. Who's going to make sure the United Nations is doing the right thing? So that's another matter. How do you enforce international law? And perhaps you could do it try to do it through moral suasion, or threatening to make the offending state an international pariah with whom no one will trade. These are possibilities. Right now, I simply want to look at the principles the Church upheld. Now, in the 16th century, from the 15th into the 16th centuries, Spanish theologians and individuals began to get reports coming back from the New World of Spanish mistreatment of the natives there. And this provoked a severe crisis of conscience among Spain's philosophers and theologians, because they began to ask themselves, how should we interact with these new peoples? Is our own government upholding the moral standards in which we claim to believe? So what it did was it provoked a lot of reflection about the nature of moral obligation. And in particular, the nature of moral obligation on the international sphere. So that is to say, they began asking themselves crucial questions. How should different peoples interact with each other? How should governments interact with each other? Are there absolute rules that should be observed? Well, this interaction between Spaniards and the peoples of the New World provided an unprecedented opportunity for theologians suddenly to entertain these questions. And this is where the idea of international law comes from, as these Spanish theologians are critically evaluating the behavior of their own government. They are deciding that, yes, there are moral rules. And in fact, in some cases, our own government is not obeying them. Now, the very fact that there was a crisis of conscience among Spanish theologians is itself significant. Because think, did Attila the Hun ever stop and say, you know, I shouldn't be looting and raping and pillaging like this. I mean, how dare I do these things? These people have rights just as I do. Well, of course, it never even occurred to him to ask questions like that. Or the Aztecs, for example, who engaged in human sacrifice. We have absolutely no record of any soul-searching that occurred in Aztec civilization, of people stepping back and impartially evaluating their own society and saying, you know what, maybe we shouldn't be ripping the hearts out of people. You know, maybe this is the wrong thing to do. Maybe this is a barbaric custom. We have absolutely no indication of any such critical tradition there. And yet, within the Catholic Church, when Spanish theologians look at the behavior of their government in the New World, that's exactly what they do. Is they begin asking these questions and they begin saying, should we behave this way? And are there in fact general rules we should observe that apply to all peoples? Attila the Hun didn't believe in rules that apply to all peoples. There were rules that applied to him and rules that applied to everybody else. And that has been the typical way peoples have understood their interaction with the world. We are the good people, everybody else is a barbarian, and we treat them accordingly. So this is an advance of no small significance. Now, we're coming up to the break, but when we come back, we're going to meet a figure of extraordinary importance, Father Francisco de Vitoria, who was a professor at the University of Salamanca, to which I have referred many a time. And it was Father Francisco de Vitoria who gave us the very first treatise in history on international law, setting out these principles. So let's come on back and look at that here on the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization.